crime, conspiracy. A farm on the edge of a quiet Canadian town. Today we're stepping into a story that grips an entire nation, not because it's sensational, but because it reveals cracks in society that many prefer not to see. This isn't just about one man or one farm. It's about communities, police systems, overlooked voices, and a growing darkness that unfolds over decades. And hey, before we jump into the deep end of this story, if you appreciate truth-driven documentaries, presented with compassion and clarity, go ahead and like this video, drop a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps Buried Secret Media create more deep dive content like this. Now picture this, British Columbia decades ago. Misty mornings roll across farmland. Tall trees surround quiet communities. You can hear birds, the hum of highway traffic in the distance, and sometimes, if you're anywhere near a certain property in Port Coquitlam, the unmistakable sound of pigs. Hundreds of pigs. This is where our story begins. The Pickton farm isn't hidden. It doesn't sit on a mountaintop or in the middle of a forest. It's right there, sitting confidently along the road like any other working farm. Trucks go by. Locals know the name. Kids in the neighborhood grow up hearing about the property, some even visiting for chores or after-school work. On the outside, it looks like a regular agricultural operation. On the inside, well, that's where things get complicated. Robert William Pickton is born on October 24, 1949. He comes into the world as the middle child in a family of 5. Mom, dad, older sister Linda, younger brother David, and him. From the moment he's old enough to walk, Robert's life is tied to the farm. Not in the romantic little farmer boy way, but in a tough, demanding sun-up to sundown way. Farm chores aren't unusual in rural families, but the Pickton's approach to farming is different. Pigs roam freely, barns fill with equipment, and cleanliness isn't exactly at the top of the priority list. Inside the house, animals come and go. Mud and dirt are regular household decor. It's a lifestyle, not for everyone, but for the Pickton's it's simply normal. Robert grows up absorbed in this world. School. It's secondary. Socializing? Even less important. His routine is predictable. Wake up early, feed pigs, clean pens, go to school, come home, work some more, sleep, repeat. Somewhere in this cycle, Robert begins slipping into a quieter and quieter place. Teachers say he struggles academically. Classmates don't know what to make of him. And as kids tend to do, they tease him. His smell. His clothes. His awkwardness. The fact that he always seems a little lost. While his older sister Linda eventually moves away to escape the farm life, Robert stays. And so does his younger brother. They both become deeply entrenched in the daily grind of the property, a closed-off world where the outside community barely exists. Family dynamics shape him in ways that last a lifetime. His father, Leonard, is stern, detached, and known for his hard approach to discipline. Not abusive, but deeply intimidating. The kind of father whose approval seems impossible to win. His mother, Louise, on the other hand, is a force to be reckoned with. Strong-willed, controlling, and fiercely protective of her boys, especially Robert. Her influence extends beyond chores or discipline. She is the emotional center of Robert's universe. He depends on her guidance, her approval, her presence. And when someone's entire emotional world revolves around one person, it creates a bond that's hard to break, and even harder to replace later in life. As Robert enters his teenage years, something becomes increasingly clear. He's not developing social skills the way most teens do. While others go to school dances, make friends, get part-time jobs, and experiment with independence, Robert stays on the farm. Day in, day out, he tends animals, cleans equipment, learns butchering techniques, and helps expand the family's agricultural operations. And then comes a moment that will mark a shift in his young life. His parents pass away. First the father, then the mother. And although losing parents is always painful, for someone as emotionally dependent as Robert, it's particularly destabilizing. He's not just losing a mother, he's losing the person who shaped his worldview, controlled his environment, and, in many ways, defined his identity. With their parents gone, the Pickton siblings inherit the land. And this is where the property starts changing into something more than a farm. Under Robert and David's management, the farm becomes a strange combination of a junkyard, a casual hangout spot, and a gathering place for people drifting in and out of rougher parts of the community. Cars pile up. Machinery collects dust. Buildings fall into disrepair. And yet, people keep showing up. Friends of the brothers. Old acquaintances. People who need a place to sleep. People who need work. People who don't have anywhere else to go. The farm becomes a hub, not exactly a safe one, not exactly an unsafe one, but definitely a place where the rules of everyday society don't quite apply. Meanwhile, in Vancouver's downtown east side, a 30-minute drive from the Pickton farm, life is hard. Really hard. This neighborhood, one of the most vulnerable in Canada, faces systemic challenges that go back decades. Poverty, lack of stable housing, underfunded mental health care, addiction. The list goes on. And at the heart of the downtown east side are women, many of them Indigenous women, who face disproportionately high levels of risk. Some engage in survival sex work not because they choose to, but because it's the only way to afford basic necessities. Others struggle with addiction or trauma. These women form tight-knit communities, looking out for each other in a world that doesn't look out for them. And here's where the cracks start showing. When women from this area go missing, reports don't always get immediate attention. Some cases are documented, others aren't. Some are investigated thoroughly while others assume, wrongly, that the person simply moved, left town, changed routines. These assumptions delay investigations. And those delays become deeply consequential later. As the 1980s turn into the 1990s, the number of missing women begins to rise. Friends talk about it. Outreach workers talk about it. Families talk about it. But without concrete evidence, cases float in a gray area, concerning but not conclusive. And in the middle of this, Robert Pickton begins frequenting the downtown east side. The man who grows up isolated, emotionally dependent, and socially withdrawn now mingles with some of the most vulnerable individuals in the city. People who might accept a ride to a farm if it means shelter, food, money, or even a sense of temporary safety. It's here, in the overlap between an isolated farm and an underserved urban neighborhood, that the conditions for disaster begin forming. Not because anyone expects it, but because the systems meant to catch warning signs aren't functioning the way they should. Back at the farm, the Pickton brothers expand their gatherings into full-blown events. Some locals even refer to these gatherings as the Piggy Palace parties. Loud, chaotic, and known among crowds looking for a place to drink, socialize, and escape the monotony of everyday life. The parties attract bikers, locals, travelers, and people from the downtown east side. Sometimes they attract people simply passing through. These gatherings become notorious enough that even people who have never set foot on the farm know exactly what happens there. Yet, through all of this, Robert maintains an unassuming, almost forgettable presence. He's quiet. He blends into the background. He's not the center of attention at these events, and certainly not the charismatic type. In fact, many who later interact with him describe him as awkward, shy, or simply odd, but rarely threatening. And that's part of the problem. Because it's easy to overlook red flags when the person waving them doesn't seem capable of causing harm. Meanwhile, the downtown east side continues to face a growing crisis. Women are disappearing at a rate that simply doesn't make sense. Friends report them missing. Families worry. But for years, nothing breaks open the pattern. No major investigation, no sweeping response, no unified effort. Cases remain separated, fragmented in different police systems, siloed in different departments. And as long as the disappearances stay categorized as individual cases, the bigger picture remains unseen. All the while, Robert Pickton continues visiting the neighborhood, connecting with individuals who are struggling, offering rides, offering food, offering the promise of money. And when someone living on the edge is offered help, even from a stranger, it's hard to turn it down. People notice Robert, but only in passing. No one thinks he's a threat. He's just the quiet pig farmer who occasionally drives through, minding his business. That's the image he carries. An invisible presence. It's only years later, when the truth comes out, that people look back and say, I should have known something wasn't right. But hindsight is always clearer, and in the moment, people simply see what they're used to seeing. Then one day something small happens, something no one thinks is significant, and it sets off a chain reaction that exposes the truth lurking beneath the surface of the Pickton farm. A disagreement on the property. A minor police call. The kind of thing that normally gets filed away and forgotten. But this time officers show up. They take notes. They notice something that doesn't match the story they're told. And for the first time in decades, law enforcement looks at the Pickton property and says, wait a second. That moment, simple, accidental, and seemingly insignificant, becomes the spark that ignites one of the largest forensic investigations in Canadian history. And that's where the story truly begins to unravel. When police visit the Pickton farm that day, they aren't expecting much. It's supposed to be a quick stop. Check in, settle a dispute, maybe give someone a warning, and then head back to regular duties. Officers walk onto the property ready to do exactly that. But the moment they step inside, something shifts. It isn't a dramatic movie moment. No music swells, no lightning cracks, no sudden revelation. It's more subtle, something about the energy of the place. The stillness, the clutter, the shadows in the corners. Officers don't say it out loud, but they feel it. Something doesn't fit. Something about the environment pushes them from casual observation into quiet suspicion. As they look around, noting items that seem out of place, the officers realize they don't have enough authority to search the property. Not yet. But they do have enough to report what they've seen. So they jot down details, mark the experience in their minds, and leave with a lingering feeling, the kind of gut instinct police learn to pay attention to. That instinct becomes the first small crack in the surface. But as anyone familiar with cracks knows, once one appears, more follow. In the city, meanwhile, the concerns in the downtown east side grow louder. People aren't just whispering anymore. Outreach workers, advocates, and families express frustration, fear, even desperation. Too many women are disappearing without explanation. Too many friends are asking questions no one seems able to answer. By this point, the number of missing women is alarming. Not one or two. Not a handful. Dozens. Each one a person with a name, a story, a family, and a life that matters. Yet files remain scattered across multiple jurisdictions. Cases cross over without being connected. Officers retire. Others transfer. Paperwork migrates from one desk to another, losing the urgency it deserves. In many other neighborhoods, a cluster of disappearances sparks immediate multi-unit investigations. Press conferences. Public alerts. Task forces. But the downtown east side isn't treated like other neighborhoods. These women are often overlooked, not intentionally but systemically. And systemic neglect is its own kind of tragedy. Rumors start growing inside the community. People recall the strange pig farmer. The one who offers rides. The one who seems harmless but also unsettling. Women tell each other to avoid his truck. Some do. Others, struggling with homelessness or addiction, take the chance because they need the help. The Pickton farm, meanwhile, becomes more chaotic. More cluttered. More unpredictable. Vehicles pile up. Old equipment rusts into the soil. Items that don't belong on a farm appear in barns and sheds. People come and go, staying for nights at a time, then disappearing again into the city. And among all of this is Robert, quiet, calm, blending in with the mess he's lived in since childhood. When police return to the farm, this time with a more specific purpose, the atmosphere feels different. They look closer at buildings. They look closer at the trailers. And then, while examining a structure on the property, they find something that stops them. An item connected to a missing woman. It's not dramatic or graphic. It isn't a smoking gun. It's something small, the kind of item most people overlook. But for investigators, it's enough. Enough to raise alarms. Enough to secure warrants. Enough to begin what becomes one of the most extensive crime scene examinations in Canadian history. The Pickton farm is sealed off with police tape. Forensic experts arrive in waves. Specialists in anthropology, DNA analysis, evidence recovery, and large-scale search operations. Officers establish a command center. Search teams put on protective suits. They move slowly, methodically, documenting every inch of ground. Now, imagine trying to search a property filled with decades of clutter, machinery, animal pens, and makeshift buildings. It's not a tidy, organized farm. It's practically a maze of objects, debris, dirt, and time. And investigators have to comb through it all. Forensics begin examining freezers, sheds, old trailers, abandoned vehicles, and piles of objects scattered across several acres. Some structures have been untouched for years. Others appear to have been recently disturbed. Every item becomes potential evidence. Every corner must be checked. What they find begins slowly, then picks up pace like dominoes falling one by one. More personal belongings linked to missing women. Documents. Clothing. Items no one can logically explain away. Suddenly, this isn't just an unusual farm. It's a crime scene. A massive one. As news spreads that police are searching the Pickton property, the community reacts. Families of the missing hold their breath. Media vans appear. Locals gather near the police perimeter, whispering to each other. For some, the farm has always felt unsettling. For others, the revelation is shocking. And while investigators dig deeper, the public begins asking a question that will haunt this case forever. How did this go unnoticed for so long? To answer that, we return to the downtown east side. For years, advocates beg for a major, unified investigation into the missing women. They meet with police. They host vigils. They organize marches. They talk to journalists. But without concrete evidence pointing to a single suspect, or even a single pattern, the requests get bogged down in bureaucratic uncertainty. As a result, the disappearances continue without an urgent coordinated response. And that's one of the biggest tragedies of this entire case. The voices warning about danger are there the whole time. People in the downtown east side aren't silent. They aren't ignoring the pattern. They aren't dismissing the seriousness. They see the danger clearly because they are living in it. But their warnings don't break through the gaps in the system. Not until it's too late. Back on the farm, the forensic investigation becomes overwhelming in scale. Officers bring in excavators, sift screens, cadaver dogs, and evidence teams working around the clock. It's not just a few barns, it becomes the single largest crime scene examination in Canadian history, spanning years. More than 200,000 separate pieces of evidence are catalogued. Thousands of hours of forensic analysis take place. And yet, even with all of this, investigators face challenges. Weather, decomposition, contamination, the age of some items, the fact that the property has been used by dozens, even hundreds of people for decades. It's like trying to complete a puzzle with half the pieces missing and the other half scattered across a field. At the same time, witnesses begin coming forward. People who once hung around the farm. People who visited occasionally. People who lived on the property temporarily. Their stories vary. Some are vague, some are startlingly specific. They talk about uncomfortable experiences, about things they saw or heard that didn't feel right, about times they felt unsafe but couldn't fully explain why. One witness describes walking past a shed and feeling something was off, as if a presence lingered there that shouldn't have been. Another recalls a friend going to the farm and never seeing her again. A third remembers a disturbing conversation with Robert, not explicit or confessive, but unsettling in tone and implication. The more testimonies investigators collect, the clearer the pattern becomes. This farm isn't just a place where crimes may have happened. It's a place where danger has been brewing for years, unnoticed by the outside world. The police arrest Robert Pickton. But they don't immediately reveal the extent of their findings. They can't. The investigation is too big, too sensitive, too complex. They need time and they take it. The public, meanwhile, speculates wildly. Rumors swirl. The media struggles to understand what's fact and what's assumption. When authorities finally hold a press conference, the mood is somber. Officers step up to microphones, deliver carefully worded statements, and confirm what many fear. Evidence connects the Pickton farm to multiple missing women from the downtown east side. The reaction is immediate and emotional. Families cry not because they have answers, but because the unknown is finally closing in. Community members express heartbreak and anger. Activists say what they've said for years. These women deserved more urgency. Their disappearances deserved more attention. And as the investigation grows, it becomes clear that this case isn't just about what happened on the farm. It's also about what didn't happen in the systems designed to protect people. Social workers speak out. Outreach teams share their stories. Journalists uncover years of warnings that went unheeded. A painful truth emerges. Systemic bias plays a significant role in how missing person cases from marginalized communities are handled. Not intentional cruelty, but a combination of oversight, assumptions, and insufficient resources. The case sparks national conversations. How do we protect vulnerable communities? How do we ensure missing person reports receive equal urgency? How do we repair trust between marginalized groups and law enforcement? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they are asked loudly and repeatedly. And in the middle of all this, Robert Pickton sits in custody, calm, often expressionless, sometimes smirking faintly in a way that makes investigators uncomfortable. His quiet demeanor, once overlooked, now feels chilling. As forensic teams continue gathering evidence from the property, a process that stretches on for years, prosecutors begin building their case. They examine DNA reports, analyze witness statements, cross-reference missing person files, and try to untangle a timeline that spans decades. It isn't an easy task. Some evidence is too degraded to use. Some is too unclear. Some is circumstantial but highly compelling. Prosecutors have to determine which charges can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard required in court. And while they aim to seek justice for every victim, they must also consider what is legally achievable. In the end, they move forward with charges connected to multiple women, enough to represent the magnitude of the case, but manageable for a courtroom trial that could extend for months, even years. The trial becomes a national spectacle. Courtrooms fill with journalists, families, investigators, and curious onlookers. People line up outside long before the doors open. The atmosphere is heavy, a mix of sorrow, anger, anticipation, and exhaustion. Everyone wants closure. Everyone wants truth. Everyone wants accountability. But trials are slow, methodical, and technical. Lawyers question witnesses. They present experts. They review evidence. Days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. Every moment is carefully documented, analyzed, and scrutinized. Friends of missing women testify. Survivors share experiences. Officers describe the investigation. Forensic experts explain their findings. And through all of it, Robert Pickton sits at the defense table listening. For families, seeing him in person is surreal. Some describe feeling numb. Others feel rage. Others feel nothing at all, just a quiet emptiness where grief sits like a stone. As the trial progresses, something becomes clear to everyone watching. This case isn't just about one man's actions. It's about a society that fails its most vulnerable. It's about warning signs ignored, cries for help unanswered, and a system that needs change. And eventually, after months of testimony, evidence, and painstaking legal procedure, the jury delivers its verdict. With the verdict read, a chapter closes. But the story isn't over, not for the families, not for the city, not for Canada. Because the question remains, how did this happen? How did one farm become the center of such tragedy? And how does a community move forward from something that leaves a scar this deep? To answer that, we need to understand not just the man and not just the crimes, but the legacy, the aftermath, the reforms, the inquiries, the lessons. And that is where our story continues. The aftermath of the verdict settles like fog over the city, thick, lingering, impossible to ignore. Families gather outside the courthouse, some holding photos of loved ones, others leaning on each other for support. There are tears, quiet murmurs, moments of embrace, and long, silent stares into the distance as people try to process what the justice system has just delivered. It isn't closure. It isn't healing. It's just the next step in a long journey. For many families, the verdict confirms what they've feared for years. But it also leaves questions that may never be fully answered. The truth behind what happened on the Pickton farm doesn't fit neatly into legal proceedings. A courtroom can only hold so much. Evidence, testimony, DNA reports, these define the boundaries of what can be spoken aloud. But outside the courtroom, the story stretches much further. Investigators continue to analyze items taken from the farm. Boxes of evidence, containers of soil samples, bags of clothing, tools, personal belongings, documents, hair, fibers, materials stored in freezers. Everything. Even after the verdict, those items undergo testing, cataloging, and examination. Not for trial, but for answers. Police work shifts for years afterward, trying to identify connections, trying to match DNA, trying to understand timelines that have long since tangled like overgrown vines. The investigation doesn't end with the conviction. It expands, reaching further backward into the decades that precede the arrest. Meanwhile, outside the forensic labs and interview rooms, the public reckons with a painful truth. This case didn't have to reach this scale. It didn't have to take this long. And it didn't have to leave so many families without answers for so many years. Community advocates step forward, speaking with honesty and urgency. They talk about the missed opportunities, times when reports could have been taken more seriously, when disappearances could have sparked task forces earlier, when coordination between police agencies might have revealed a pattern long before the Pickton farm became a crime scene. In public squares, candlelight vigils become a regular scene. Women's groups lead marches. Posters of missing individuals line streetlights. Flowers pile up at memorials. Families share stories of their daughters, sisters, mothers, cousins. Stories filled with laughter, childhood memories, dreams, music, joy, pain, and resilience. And through these gatherings, a collective voice grows louder. Never again. Never again should missing women from marginalized communities go unnoticed. Never again should systemic biases influence who receives urgent attention and who does not. Never again should families have to fight this hard just to be heard. In response to the tragedy, pressure mounts. Politicians, community leaders, and law enforcement agencies feel the weight of public demand. Calls for a public inquiry grow stronger. And eventually the government agrees. An inquiry is launched, diving into the root causes, beyond the crimes themselves, into the systems that allowed so many red flags to be overlooked. The inquiry examines police practices, communication between jurisdictions, handling of missing person reports, prioritization, training, resources, and the cultural attitudes that sometimes influence which cases receive immediate urgency. Testimony from the downtown east side highlights how deeply people feel forgotten. Outreach workers describe walking the same streets day after day, handing out food, comforting community members, keeping mental notes on who they haven't seen in a while. Families recount pleading for help when their loved ones vanish, only to be met with questions about drug use, lifestyle, or housing, instead of the swift action they desperately need. For many, the inquiry isn't about blame, it's about change. It's about illuminating the cracks in the system so that future tragedies can be prevented. It's about recognizing that vulnerability does not diminish the value of a life. It's about ensuring police departments have the tools, training, and mandate to respond to every missing person report with equal seriousness. And through the inquiry, details emerge that paint a fuller picture of what life was like at the Pickton farm, not through graphic descriptions but through testimonies about the social environment, the flow of visitors, the clutter, the disorganization, and the sense of lawlessness that quietly grows around the property. People describe the farm as a place where things just happen, where rules seem optional, where people drift in and out, where no one asks too many questions, and where the line between the outside world and the world within those fences grows increasingly blurry. The inquiry highlights something important. A place like that doesn't become dangerous overnight. It evolves slowly over years. One overlooked complaint here, one uninvestigated rumor there, one missing person report filed without urgency. Bit by bit, invisibly at first, a dangerous environment forms. Once the inquiry concludes, reforms begin to take shape. Missing person units are reorganized. Policies change. Training improves. New standards are introduced for interagency cooperation. And for the first time, society acknowledges the depth of the tragedy, not just as a crime, but as a collective failure. While these reforms roll out, the memory of what happened remains a wound in British Columbia's history. Documentaries are made. Books are written. Journalists revisit the story annually, especially on anniversaries that bring renewed sorrow. Each time, the focus expands from the crime to the lessons. In community centers, educators lead discussions about safety, trauma, and social marginalization. University classes examine the case to explore sociology, criminology, and systemic bias. Law enforcement academies use the story as a case study on the importance of listening to community voices, especially those most vulnerable. And the downtown east side? It continues to evolve. Advocates work relentlessly, pushing for improved housing, expanded mental health services, safer working environments, and stronger connections between community organizations and police. There's also a shift in public perception. Where once many people viewed the downtown east side with distance or stigma, they now understand it as a community filled with individuals who deserve compassion, resources, and safety. The humanity that was overlooked for so long is finally being recognized. For the families of the missing, every year is a mix of grief and remembrance. Some hold private ceremonies. Others attend public memorials. Some keep photos on walls, candles on nightstands, or journals filled with memories. They continue speaking their loved ones' names, ensuring they are never forgotten. Meanwhile, Robert Pickton remains in custody. His name, once unknown to the world, becomes a symbol, not just of the crimes committed, but of the systemic failures that allowed those crimes to continue for so long. And that's an uncomfortable truth for many Canadians. It's one thing to hold one man responsible. It's another to confront the deeper issues within institutions meant to protect people. But confronting those issues is what allows growth. And that's what communities begin doing, acknowledging flaws, fixing structures, rebuilding trust. From the ashes of tragedy, new support networks form. Indigenous women's organizations gain greater resources. Missing person databases become more sophisticated. Public alert systems improve. Programs dedicated to the safety of sex workers expand. And police departments establish stronger ties with outreach teams who walk the streets every day. In many ways, the legacy of this case becomes a push for equity, ensuring vulnerable voices are heard, respected, and protected. And as the reforms unfold, investigators continue quietly working behind the scenes. They attempt, wherever possible, to return personal items from the farm to families of the missing. Items that once lived in boxes or evidence lockers now become cherished connections to loved ones. Some families finally receive closure. Others receive belongings they didn't know existed. Others receive nothing, and for them, the absence is its own kind of answer, devastating in its finality. Years pass and the city changes. Buildings rise. Streets shift. Communities evolve. The downtown east side continues to face challenges, but it also shows resilience. Art projects bloom. Cultural programs expand. Advocacy grows stronger. People who once felt unseen now find allies and organizations determined to protect them. But no matter how much the city changes, the memory of what happened on the Pickton farm does not fade. Not because people want to dwell in tragedy, but because remembering prevents repetition. The story becomes part of public consciousness, a reminder of the consequences of ignoring vulnerable communities. It becomes a marker in the timeline of Canadian social justice. And every year at vigils and memorials, as candles flicker against the evening sky, people read the names of those lost. They sing songs. They share stories. They place photos on poster boards and lay flowers at statues. And in those moments, the women become more than case numbers, more than headlines, more than victims. They become human beings, honored and loved. For the families, healing is not linear. Some describe years of nightmares. Others describe long periods of numbness. Some turn to advocacy to channel their grief into action. Others retreat into private remembrance. There is no right way to grieve. But there is one shared truth among them. They carry the memory of their loved ones every day. As for the community of Port Coquitlam, the presence of the Pickton farm becomes a shadow over the town's identity. Locals remember the police tape, the crowds of reporters, the helicopters overhead, the floodlights illuminating barns late into the night, the sense of shock that something so devastating could happen in a place so ordinary. And over time the land itself changes. Structures are demolished. Debris is cleared. Grass grows. Nature begins reclaiming the soil. If you walk past the area today, you won't see the original farm buildings. You won't see the cluttered barns. You won't see the environment that once stood frozen in investigative photographs. But even though the land returns to silence, people know what was there. They know the story. They know the weight the soil carries. It becomes sacred ground, not in a religious sense but in the sense of collective memory. A place where lives intersected with tragedy, where families lost loved ones, where investigators worked tirelessly, and where a nation was forced to confront its own shortcomings. And through it all, the narrative evolves. What begins as the story of a crime becomes the story of a community demanding accountability. What begins as a tragedy becomes a catalyst for change. What begins as a silent farm becomes a loud reminder to always listen to the voices of those who struggle. And that brings us to today. We tell the story not to sensationalize it, but to honor those who were lost and those who continue fighting for justice. We tell it to shine a light on the importance of compassion and vigilance. We tell it to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. And the truth is, this story's lessons echo far beyond British Columbia. Any community, anywhere in the world, can fall into patterns of overlooking people living at the margins. Any institution can unknowingly deprioritize vulnerable voices. That's why remembering matters. That's why vigilance matters. That's why change matters. And as we continue this documentary, we'll look deeper into the broader legacy, the nationwide reforms, the community recovery, the lessons for future generations, and the stories of strength that emerge from the darkest chapters. Because the aftermath of tragedy isn't just grief. It's also resilience. And this story is far from over. As the years pass, the story of the Pickton case settles into the public consciousness, transforming from breaking news into a long-term reminder of what happens when vulnerable people go unheard. The details of the investigation echo through training rooms, classrooms, advocacy meetings, and community forums. Scholars, journalists, students, and families continue to revisit the case, not for shock value, but for understanding. And while the media eventually moves on to newer headlines, the people connected to the story never do. For them, this isn't a chapter that closes. It's a constant presence, a memory that resurfaces in everyday life. A sound, a scent, a photo, a song, a date on the calendar. There are reminders everywhere. The city continues to grow, but the downtown east side remains a community filled with both hardship and astonishing resilience. Despite ongoing challenges, poverty, addiction, stigma, the area is also home to incredible strength. Artists paint murals honoring the missing. Community centers host cultural events. Outreach workers walk their routes daily, offering food, warm clothing, harm reduction supplies, and companionship. On these streets, grief and hope coexist in a way that's difficult to describe. People who lived through the years of disappearances still remember the fear of losing a friend overnight. They remember checking each block, asking around, waiting for familiar faces to appear. They remember the moments when someone didn't come back, and how that absence slowly evolved into uncertainty, then fear, then grief. High-risk communities carry memories like that forever. The reforms inspired by the case begin to take root. Missing person units become more responsive and coordinated. When a report comes in today, the urgency threshold is different. Immediate danger is no longer determined by assumptions about lifestyle. Instead, risk factors are evaluated case by case, and every situation is taken seriously from the start. Police departments integrate culturally sensitive training and build relationships with community organizations that hold decades of on-the-ground experience. Officers learn how to communicate more effectively with individuals who may have unstable housing, inconsistent contact information, or distrust of authority. And as these relationships strengthen, a sense of shared responsibility emerges, a commitment to preventing events like those on the Pickton farm from ever happening again. In schools, criminology classes examine the case as an example of how serial investigations can be hindered by systemic issues, but also how they can improve with structural reform. Students read reports, testimonies, and inquiry findings. They study maps of the downtown East Side, learning about the geography of vulnerability. They analyze policing strategies, looking for potential improvements. They listen to guest speakers from the community who provide first-hand insight into what went wrong and how society can do better. In Indigenous studies programs, the case becomes part of broader discussions about the disproportionate violence faced by Indigenous women across North America. Students learn about historic trauma, systemic failures, and the importance of culturally informed safety measures. They explore the frameworks behind movements like Red Dress Day and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Initiative. These discussions remind people that the Pickton case isn't isolated. It's part of a larger story about which voices are prioritized and which are overlooked. In law enforcement academies, instructors emphasize the importance of trust between police and marginalized communities, trust that must be built slowly, consistently, and respectfully. New cadets practice how to handle missing person calls, how to review patterns of disappearances, and how to collaborate with outreach organizations. They study how missteps in the Pickton case delayed justice, and how small oversights can snowball into major investigative roadblocks. All of these efforts, academic, legal, cultural, contribute to a slowly shifting national conscience. People begin to understand that vulnerability does not equal invisibility, that every life matters regardless of circumstance, that everyone deserves protection, and that systems must be built with equity in mind. On the ground, community members become more vigilant than ever. When someone goes missing today, social media amplifies the alert instantly. Posters are printed. Volunteers organize search teams. Hashtags trend across platforms. Neighborhood networks activate their phone trees. People who once felt unheard now have stronger community tools to raise their voices. And yet, despite these improvements, grief continues to ripple through the families affected by the Pickton case. Parents grow older, some passing away without full closure. Siblings build lives of their own, but carry the absence of their loved ones into every milestone: graduations, weddings, births, holidays. Children who lost mothers grow into adults who only know them through photos and stories. For these families, healing is not about forgetting. It's about integrating the loss into their lives in a way that allows them to move forward while still honoring the memory of the person they lost. Some turn to advocacy, becoming voices for those still missing or at risk. They speak at conferences, attend marches, participate in policy discussions, and work with organizations determined to protect vulnerable women. Their advocacy becomes a testament to the love they continue to hold. Others choose quieter paths. They visit memorials on anniversaries, keep scrapbooks, or light candles in their homes. They tell stories to grandchildren, ensuring that memories are passed down with dignity. They choose to grieve privately in spaces where they feel safe. As for the land where the Pickton farm once stood, it undergoes a transformation. The structures associated with the investigation are removed. Heavy equipment tears down buildings that once held secrets, leaving empty fields behind. Over time, grass grows in patches. Trees reclaim the edges. The wind blows across the space with a different sound, no longer caught between rusting metal and decaying boards. Some locals say the land feels lighter now. Others say it feels heavier, as if the memories cling to the soil. Visitors sometimes stop by the perimeter not to gawk but to pay respects. It's not a tourist site. It's not marked with signs or plaques. It's simply a quiet piece of ground that holds history in ways few places do. The story reaches beyond British Columbia. Across Canada, Communities re-evaluate how they handle missing person crises. They examine their own procedures and policies, comparing them to the inquiry's findings. They ask difficult questions. Are we doing enough? Are vulnerable people safe? Are we listening? In some provinces, task forces launch new initiatives focused specifically on cases involving Indigenous women. Support networks develop for families who fear their loved ones are at risk. Hotlines expand. Data sharing improves between agencies. These steps don't undo the past, but they aim to protect the future. Journalists continue covering the case, but with a shift in tone. Early reporting focused heavily on the criminal details. Later reporting focuses on the victims, their lives, not just their losses. Profiles highlight their personalities, talents, and dreams. They remind the public that these women were not defined by their vulnerabilities. They were people who loved music, painted, cooked, laughed, danced, dreamed, and deserved long, safe lives. Through these stories, the public begins to understand the scale of the tragedy in a deeper, more human way. Not as a case file. Not as a headline. But as a collection of lived lives. As the years unfold, the Pickton case becomes a reference point in discussions about public safety, women's rights, and social justice. It becomes a chapter taught in schools and reflected on in policy meetings. It becomes a reminder that ignoring marginalized voices has consequences. That every report matters. That every disappearance deserves urgency. And yet, even with reforms in place, the families continue facing an absence that reforms cannot fix. No legislation can replace a lost life. No policy can ease the pain of what happened. No inquiry can fully heal the wounds. But many families say that change is its own form of justice. Not the kind that appears in a courtroom, but the kind that prevents future harm. The kind that ensures their loved ones did not die for nothing. The downtown east side continues to honor the women who were lost. Community murals feature their faces. Vigils are held annually, with hundreds of people filling the streets holding candles and red roses. Songs are sung. Names are read aloud. One by one. Slowly. Carefully. Respectfully. And as each name is spoken, the crowd responds, "We remember." These events are powerful. Not because they erase the tragedy, but because they transform grief into unity. They remind everyone that memory is an act of resistance. Resistance against erasure, against indifference, against injustice. The story's legacy also inspires new generations of activists. Young people join organizations dedicated to protecting women, improving safety nets, and fighting for systemic equity. They study the case. They analyze the failures. They learn from them. And they vow not to let history repeat itself. And through this wave of advocacy, Canada slowly becomes more aware of the invisible populations living on the margins. More aware of how easily society can overlook those who face the greatest danger. More aware of how important it is to center compassion, fairness, and dignity in every decision. In interviews years later, investigators sometimes describe the case as the most difficult of their careers. Not because of the size of the farm or the complexity of the evidence, but because of the emotional toll, the weight of knowing how many lives were lost and how many families suffered in silence. They talk about the long hours, the sleepless nights, the frustrations, and the determination that kept them going. They talk about the moments they had to step outside for fresh air, to gather themselves before returning to the search. They talk about how the case changed them, as officers and as people. Some say they become more empathetic. Others say they become more protective of vulnerable communities. Many say the case forever alters how they view missing person reports. A single piece of paper on a desk is no longer just information. It's a life, a family, a story that must be honored. And through their reflections we learn something essential, that justice is not only pursued in courtrooms. It is also pursued in empathy, willingness to listen, and commitment to improvement. The story eventually becomes part of Canada's collective memory, a reminder written not in stone monuments, but in policy reforms, community connections, academic lessons, and the hearts of the families who continue to carry love through their grief. And even decades later, when people mention the case, they do so with a solemn tone. Not to sensationalize, but to acknowledge the magnitude of the tragedy and the strength of those who survived its aftermath. Because in the end, this story is not only about a man and a crime. It is about resilience, justice, memory, and the power of community to rebuild after devastating loss. And as we move forward, there is one truth that stands above all. Every life, no matter how vulnerable, deserves protection. Every disappearance deserves attention. Every warning deserves action. And every person deserves to be heard. This is the legacy the families fight for. This is the lesson the nation carries. And this is the reason we tell this story today, to honor lives lost, uplift communities still healing, and ensure that justice reaches those who need it most. With time, something begins to shift across the country. Awareness. Awareness of social gaps. Awareness of systemic challenges. Awareness of the fact that tragedies like this don't happen in isolation. They grow in the quiet spaces where institutions overlook vulnerability and where communities struggle to be heard. And awareness, as simple as it sounds, becomes one of the most powerful tools for change. Across Canada, and even beyond its borders, the story prompts discussions about how societies treat people who live on the margins. Governments begin reviewing their social safety structures. Advocacy groups push for better mental health resources, more accessible shelters, safer working conditions, and greater protections for women at risk. Conversations about Indigenous rights, equity, and historical injustices gain momentum. The more people talk, the more the nation begins to understand a deeper truth. Tragedies often illuminate the places where society needs to grow. As these efforts unfold, a quiet evolution begins within law enforcement agencies. Officers start approaching missing person cases with new urgency. Departments improve communication between units, creating information pathways that didn't exist before. When a person disappears today, their case is integrated into databases that analyze patterns quickly and efficiently. No longer do cases sit isolated on separate desks. No longer do reports get lost in paperwork. Advocates say the Pickton case becomes a turning point, a painful one, yes, but also a catalyst for reform that saves lives in the future. And inevitably, conversations turn toward the families. The women who were lost are not distant names on a list. They are daughters, mothers, friends, neighbors, and community members. Some loved animals. Some painted. Some counseled friends through hard times. Some laughed loudly, some quietly. Some were natural leaders. Some held on to dreams even when life dealt them challenges. One by one, families come forward to share the stories of who their loved ones were before the headlines, stories filled with warmth, humor, and humanity. These memories become part of the case's legacy as well. They give the public a fuller picture of the lives behind the statistics. In the midst of these stories, something becomes clear. These women were loved deeply. Their lives mattered. And because they mattered, their absence resonates through time. Their loved ones carry their memories into everything they do. A mother sets a place at the table during the holidays. A sister keeps a necklace in her drawer. A friend still talks about the times they shared. These moments remind the world that the women lost in this case are not defined by the tragedy. They are defined by who they were in life. Meanwhile, community healing becomes a long-term project. Healing doesn't mean erasing pain. It means learning to live alongside it while creating new spaces for hope. Neighborhood organizations host art workshops, peer support meetings, and cultural ceremonies dedicated to honoring women affected by violence. Street gatherings take place not just as memorials, but as celebrations of resilience. At annual marches, thousands of people walk through city streets holding signs, banners, and candles. Elders speak. Drummers lead songs. Families release prayers into the wind. The atmosphere is both somber and empowering, a reminder that remembrance is a collective act. And these marches inspire others. Cities across Canada start their own events, standing in solidarity with Vancouver's downtown east side. The message spreads. Every woman deserves safety. Every community deserves protection. Every voice deserves to be heard. In classrooms, students discuss the case with seriousness and compassion. They analyze how stereotypes and biases influence policing and public perception. They talk about intersectionality, vulnerability, and the need for systemic change. Teachers emphasize that tragedies like this don't happen because of one failure, they happen because of many small failures that accumulate over time. This understanding sparks a new generation of advocates, lawyers, social workers, and researchers who seek to correct those failures. As society continues moving forward, the land where the Pickton farm stood remains quiet. The silence doesn't erase what happened, but it creates a space for reflection. Some say the quiet is healing. Others say it's haunting. But either way, the land no longer holds the physical structures once associated with the tragedy. Nature begins to reclaim the soil, letting grass and wildflowers grow where buildings used to stand. And as nature repairs the land, communities repair themselves. Reporters who covered the case look back on those years with a mix of sadness and responsibility. Many say they struggled to balance the need for public awareness with respect for victims and their families. They acknowledge that early coverage often focused too heavily on the suspect, overshadowing the women whose lives were lost. With time, reporting shifts toward a more compassionate narrative, one that humanizes the victims, centers their stories, and calls for accountability. This shift in media coverage becomes part of the broader cultural change sparked by the case. Newsrooms re-examine their approach to reporting on missing women, particularly those from marginalized communities. Sensationalism is replaced with context. Simplified narratives are replaced with nuanced stories. The result? More visibility for vulnerable groups and more pressure on institutions to respond effectively. In government offices, policymakers review recommendations from the public inquiry. These recommendations lead to updated legislation, improved support services, and stronger community partnerships. Funding increases for shelters, addiction services, and outreach programs. Indigenous leaders collaborate with officials to address long-standing inequities. Change happens slowly, sometimes frustratingly slowly, but steadily. In conversations across the nation, the Pickton case becomes a symbol of why this work matters. It is a reminder that the safety of vulnerable women cannot be taken lightly. That ignoring early warnings has consequences. That structural change is necessary, not optional. Through documentaries, books, and educational programs, the story continues to be told, not to dwell on suffering but to amplify the lessons learned. And these lessons ripple outward. They influence discussions on women's safety worldwide. They inspire advocacy beyond Canada's borders. And yet, the emotional core of this story remains with the families. They are the heartbeat of the narrative, the ones who carry the memories, the ones who push for justice long after cameras leave and the world moves on. Some families speak openly about their grief. Others protect their privacy. Some join support circles. Others create foundations or scholarships in honor of their loved ones. Each response is different, but all are shaped by the same truth. The loss never disappears, it simply changes shape. The downtown east side continues to evolve. Housing initiatives expand. Community health services improve. Indigenous cultural centers grow stronger. Harm reduction strategies become more widely accepted. And although challenges remain, there is more awareness, more advocacy, and more unity than ever before. And through all these years, the name Robert Pickton remains part of the story, but no longer the center of it. He becomes a figure studied for criminological understanding, not for sensational focus. A symbol of failure, not fascination. His crimes force society to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, but they do not define the people whose lives he harmed. In interviews many years after the case, community elders speak about how trauma doesn't disappear. It settles into the bones of a community. But so does resilience. Resilience becomes woven into daily life, into traditions, into advocacy, into acts of kindness and community care. And that resilience is what continues to guide the people of the downtown east side forward. Family members who once fought tirelessly to have their loved ones' disappearances investigated, now push for national awareness campaigns addressing violence against women. Their voices are stronger than ever, not because the pain has lessened, but because they refuse to let the world forget the importance of this issue. And as these families speak, the public listens. Support grows. Communities stand together. The demand for justice expands beyond this case, becoming part of a global conversation about protecting vulnerable individuals. With time, cultural memory shifts. People no longer speak of the Pickton farm without also acknowledging the systemic failures that allowed such tragedy to unfold. They discuss how society can build better safety nets, how governments can invest in supportive services, and how communities can stand beside those who face the greatest dangers. And in these conversations, something becomes clear. Even the darkest stories can guide society toward the light, not because of the tragedy itself, but because of the response to it. This story carries a lesson that reaches far beyond the borders of one city or one country. The measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable. When those voices go unheard, harm grows in silence. When those voices are finally acknowledged, change becomes possible. And if there is any hope to draw from this story, it's that change is happening. Slowly, yes. Imperfectly, yes. But undeniably. And this change, born from heartbreak, from loss, from the voices of families and community members, becomes the lasting legacy of this case. A legacy rooted not in tragedy, but in transformation. A legacy carried forward by the people who refuse to forget. And as we continue this documentary, we step deeper into that legacy, into the lessons, the reforms, and the path forward. Because the story isn't just about what happened. It's about what must happen next. As the years continue passing, the Pickton case remains an anchor in Canada's collective memory, a reminder not only of what happened, but of what must never happen again. The story becomes woven into the fabric of national conversations about violence, justice, and the safety of marginalized women. And as more time goes by, the way people tell the story shifts. It matures. It deepens. Journalists revisit the case with greater nuance. Educators teach it with greater sensitivity. Communities remember it with greater unity. And families speak of their loved ones not only in terms of loss, but in terms of life, honoring the joys, talents, and histories that shape the people they miss. In this evolving conversation, one theme becomes clearer. The true meaning of justice extends far beyond the courtroom. Justice is not simply a sentence handed down. Justice is reform, awareness, visibility, and the collective promise that society will do better. As communities begin to rebuild trust with law enforcement, new partnerships form between police and social service agencies. Officers participate in outreach walks, embedding themselves directly into communities they once understood from a distance. They listen to concerns. They gather information. They build rapport. And in doing so, they bridge gaps that once seemed insurmountable. Outreach workers teach officers about the realities of life in the downtown East Side, about the complexity of addiction, the challenges of unstable housing, the importance of trauma-informed communication. Officers share information about how missing person reports flow through the system, where delays can occur, and how they're now trained to prevent those delays. This two-way relationship becomes one of the most significant outcomes of the Pickton case. It signals a shift from an us versus them mentality to a shared mission, protecting vulnerable people regardless of circumstances. On the ground, social service organizations expand their presence. Harm reduction centers offer safer spaces. Nonprofits provide transitional housing. Indigenous-led programs reconnect community members with culture, language, and spiritual practices, all of which play essential roles in healing trauma. These programs don't erase the past, but they build a foundation for a healthier future. And slowly this foundation grows stronger. In the downtown East Side, murals depicting the missing women become symbols of hope and remembrance. Their faces, painted in vibrant colors, gaze over busy streets. People pause to look at them. Some leave flowers at the base of the murals. Others stand in silence. These murals serve as both memorials and reminders of lives lost and reminders of resilience. In community centers, healing circles bring people together to share stories, grieve collectively, and support one another. Elders lead ceremonies honoring the spirits of the women. Drumming echoes through gymnasium floors. Families sit side by side holding tissues, hands, and memories. Every year, on days dedicated to honoring missing and murdered women, crowds gather with signs, red dresses, and candles. They move through the city streets chanting chants of solidarity, calling for protection, raising awareness. People from all backgrounds join these marches. Students, elders, families, social workers, teachers, neighbors, law enforcement, political leaders. It becomes a movement woven across generations. And as communities grow stronger, the national conversation grows stronger too. Universities publish research on systemic biases. Scholars explore how the intersection of poverty, addiction, racism, and gender-based violence affects the likelihood of people going missing. Conferences bring experts together to share knowledge on improving prevention strategies. Nonprofits collaborate with Indigenous leaders to advocate for national policy reforms. One of the most important lessons that emerges is the importance of listening, really listening, to communities that live with the highest risks. Listening to warning signs. Listening to fear. Listening to the people who know the streets best. This seems so simple, yet historically, it's one of the most overlooked aspects of public safety. And the Pickton case becomes a powerful illustration of why listening matters. Meanwhile, within families, the wound remains, but the way they carry it begins to change. Some families create scholarships in memory of their loved ones. Others volunteer in outreach programs to help women in crisis. Some join committees aimed at improving missing person investigations. Through these actions, they channel their grief into purpose, ensuring their loved ones' lives have impact far beyond the tragedy. Friends of the missing women often remain connected even decades later. They lean on each other during anniversaries. They attend vigils together. They reminisce about the laughter and the small moments they shared. Spontaneous dance sessions, late-night conversations, shared meals, inside jokes. These memories become sacred threads linking them to the past. For many loved ones, healing also involves confronting the public narrative, correcting misconceptions, and challenging stigmatization. They want the world to see the missing women not as statistics or labels, but as full, complex human beings. And slowly their message takes root. Public understanding evolves. People begin to grasp the danger of dehumanizing language and harmful stereotypes. As society becomes more aware of the factors that place individuals at risk, discussions shift toward solutions: economic supports, accessible treatment programs, safe housing, and community integration. In cities across the country, new policies emerge. Police departments adopt mandatory review periods for missing person cases. Databases integrate features that detect patterns earlier. Shelters receive increased funding. Youth outreach programs expand. Indigenous-led initiatives gain prominence. Each step represents growth built on the lessons of the past. And beyond the borders of Canada, the Pickton case influences research on serial investigations worldwide. Criminologists dissect the case to understand how offenders select victims, how community vulnerabilities intersect with criminal opportunities, and how environmental factors shape patterns of offending. Their work contributes to global knowledge about prevention and early intervention. Throughout the academic world, the case becomes a critical example of why cross-disciplinary collaboration is essential. Criminologists, social workers, psychologists, anthropologists, and forensic scientists analyze the case from different angles. Their combined perspectives paint a more complete picture of the complex social ecosystem that allowed the tragedy to occur. In law schools, discussions center around how the legal system handles high-profile cases, how evidence is presented, how jury biases can affect outcomes, and how sentencing reflects societal values. Students debate the challenges prosecutors faced, the limitations of the evidence, and the broader implications for justice. In psychology programs, students explore themes of trauma, attachment, environmental influences, and the cognitive mechanisms underlying violent behavior. Professors emphasize the importance of early intervention and the impact of upbringing on adult personality development. In sociology classes, the case sparks analysis about social inequality, power structures, and the role of marginalization in criminal vulnerability. Students discuss how community neglect can create environments where predators operate unnoticed. And through all these academic discussions, one truth stays at the center. This story is not just about one person's actions. It's about the conditions that allowed those actions to continue. As we move further through time, the landscape of the downtown East Side continues shifting. New buildings rise. Social housing complexes expand. Community gardens sprout. Cultural centers grow. Neighborhood murals blaze with color, celebrating indigenous identity and honoring the women who were lost. Tourists visiting the city sometimes wander through these streets without understanding the history beneath their feet. But for locals, the weight of memory is everywhere. On street corners where friends once stood, in alleyways where outreach workers once searched, in buildings that once housed the missing. And yet, these same streets also hold hope. Because the community hasn't given up. The people who live here haven't given up. They continue fighting for safety, for justice, for recognition, and for change. And their efforts are not in vain. In national conversations about gender-based violence, indigenous rights, and missing women, this case is frequently referenced as a turning point, a moment when Canada collectively realized it needed to do better. The reforms that followed are still evolving, still expanding, still adjusting to meet the needs of vulnerable communities. And as these reforms spread, the Pickton case becomes less of a story about one farm and more of a story about the need for vigilance, compassion, and collective action. Families of the missing sometimes speak about the strange duality of living with this legacy. On one hand, the pain is unbearable. On the other, the change it inspires brings a sense of meaning, not enough to heal the wound but enough to create purpose. And that purpose drives them. It keeps them attending meetings. It keeps them speaking publicly. It keeps them advocating for a safer world for future generations. Meanwhile, the land in Port Coquitlam remains quiet. People who pass by describe the air as still, the kind of stillness that invites reflection. The structures that once stood there are gone, but the story remains embedded in the community's memory, carried through conversations, through education, through activism. The city, in its own way, holds space for the past while continuing to move forward. And through all of this movement, all of this growth, one message resonates clearly: remembering the past is not just an act of sorrow. It is an act of protection. A protection for those living today. A protection for those who will come tomorrow. A promise that the mistakes of yesterday will not be repeated. This story, though rooted in tragedy, becomes a guide, a guide for police, for families, for communities, for policymakers, for students, for anyone who seeks to create a safer and more compassionate world. And as we approach the final phase of this documentary, we look at the future, the world shaped by the lessons learned, the reforms implemented, and the voices that refuse to be silenced. Because in the end, the story isn't simply about what happened on a farm. It's about how a nation rises from tragedy, and how memory becomes the foundation for lasting change. As the story moves further into the future, its influence continues reaching new generations. People who weren't even alive during the height of the case learn about it in schools, documentaries, community events, and family conversations. It becomes one of those defining chapters in Canadian history, the kind that teachers mention with a quiet seriousness, the kind that sparks discussions about humanity, responsibility, and equity. And with each passing year, society reflects more openly on what the case reveals about how communities treat their most vulnerable members. The story becomes a lens through which people examine their own biases, their own assumptions, and their own obligations to speak up when something feels wrong. In the downtown East Side, where so much pain was once concentrated, more community-driven solutions begin to emerge. Local organizations develop peer support programs run by residents with lived experience. People who understand the challenges of addiction, homelessness, trauma, and stigma because they have walked those paths themselves. Their insights become invaluable. These programs help protect women who might otherwise be isolated. They create safe spaces where people can check in with each other, share information, and report concerns before they escalate. This kind of grassroots vigilance becomes one of the most effective strategies for preventing tragedies. Alongside these efforts, Indigenous-led safety initiatives continue to grow. Elders and knowledge keepers host circles that center traditional teachings on community care. Young people learn about the importance of watching over one another, the significance of ceremony, and the shared responsibility to safeguard women and girls. Cultural revitalization becomes a form of healing. Language classes, drumming groups, art workshops, storytelling sessions. These activities strengthen identity and connection, both of which are critical for building resilience in communities historically marginalized and overlooked. As these programs expand, policymakers take note. Governments begin providing more consistent funding for Indigenous-designed and Indigenous-led safety initiatives. Leaders acknowledge that culturally informed solutions are essential for protecting vulnerable women. And slowly, a shift occurs. The focus turns from reaction to prevention. In the midst of these developments, families of the missing continue carrying their loved ones with them. Many say anniversaries feel as sharp now as they did decades ago. They describe waking up on certain days with heaviness in their chest. They place flowers at memorials. They look at old photos, replaying memories that feel both distant and painfully close. Some families say they dream of their loved ones, dreams filled with laughter, visions of childhood, flashes of peaceful moments. They say those dreams feel like visits, moments that remind them love doesn't disappear with time. These small moments of connection help them navigate grief that has no endpoint. And every time new opportunities arise to speak about the case, whether at a conference, a school, an interview, or a ceremony, the families show incredible strength by sharing their stories again and again. They do it not because it's easy, but because they know their voices change lives. In their words, the women who were lost become real to people who never met them. They become more than names. They become the heartbeat of the story. Investigators who work the case often attend these events as well. They sit quietly in the crowd, sometimes placing a hand over their hearts when a familiar name is spoken. Many of them say the case changed them forever. Some say it reshaped their understanding of humanity. Some say it made them more compassionate, more attentive, more present. And for officers who were young at the time of the investigation, the case influences their entire approach to policing. Many dedicate their careers to missing person units or community outreach. They teach younger officers the importance of intuition, of listening, of urgency. They remind them that protecting vulnerable women is not an optional duty, it is a core part of the profession. Beyond law enforcement, mental health professionals and trauma counselors continue studying the case to improve support services for communities affected by violence. They examine how trauma travels, not just through individuals but through families, neighborhoods, and generations. They identify risk factors for long-term distress and develop strategies to support healing. These professionals emphasize that trauma doesn't always appear immediately. Sometimes it emerges years later in unexpected ways. Sometimes it shows up as anxiety, sleeplessness, sudden emotion, or withdrawal. And knowing this helps communities respond with empathy rather than judgment. In classrooms, students sit in circles discussing the case with thoughtful seriousness. They ask questions about justice, fairness, privilege, and protection. They realize that safety is not equal for everyone, and that they have a role to play in correcting that. In these discussions, teachers often encourage students to imagine a world where every voice is valued equally. What would that world look like? How would institutions function? How would communities care for one another? These conversations plant seeds that may grow into future reforms. And that's one of the most powerful elements of this story, its ability to inspire future generations to think differently, act differently, and build differently. In policy circles, the case continues shaping national strategy. Panels review progress annually, assessing whether recommendations from the public inquiry have been implemented effectively. New initiatives are added based on community feedback. Reports outline successes and highlight areas where additional work is still required. And although progress is far from complete, there is movement. Real movement. Tangible movement. Slow, yes, but steady. Meanwhile, the downtown East Side continues to grow as a community defined not by tragedy, but by resilience. Neighborhood events highlight local music, art, and cultural practices. People celebrate milestones together: birthdays, achievements, recovery anniversaries. Volunteers clean streets, plant gardens, and prepare meals. The presence of joy in a place once associated with grief becomes its own form of victory. Over time, the public narrative surrounding the case matures. The sensational details that once dominated conversations fade, replaced by deeper discussion about systemic change, community care, and the importance of protecting women who face disproportionate risk. In many ways, the women become symbols, not of tragedy but of transformation. Their stories reshape the country's understanding of how violence flourishes in silence and how vigilance can prevent harm. And as the story continues being told, more people learn to recognize the signs of danger in their own communities. They learn to speak up when something feels wrong. They learn to check in on friends who suddenly disappear. They learn the importance of taking every missing person report seriously. The lessons ripple outward, beyond British Columbia, beyond Canada, touching people in cities around the world. People who work in social services, policing, journalism, education, and community advocacy. They apply these lessons in their own neighborhoods, adopting new approaches to protect vulnerable women. And through this ripple effect, a story rooted in one place becomes a guiding point for global awareness. The Pickton case is often described as one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history, but darkness is only part of its story. The other part is the light that emerges afterward. The solidarity, the advocacy, the change policies, the strengthened communities, the improved protections. The tragedy forces society to evolve. Not out of convenience but out of necessity. And through that evolution, a new understanding emerges, one that recognizes the inherent worth of every person, regardless of life's challenges. This evolution is ongoing. It's not something that happens overnight. It requires continuous effort, continuous reflection, continuous commitment. But it is happening. And because it is happening, the women lost become more than victims. They become catalysts for change. Their stories inspire thousands of people to fight for justice, to care for their communities, to protect those who might otherwise go unnoticed. Their stories become the reason new laws are written, new programs are launched, new conversations begin. And in this way, their legacy becomes powerful. A legacy carried by families, by advocates, by investigators, by teachers, by students, by communities across the nation. And it is this legacy that brings us to the final chapter of this documentary, a chapter not rooted in the past but in the future. A future built from lessons learned. A future shaped by reforms. A future guided by compassion. A future where vulnerable women are protected, not ignored. And as we move into this final reflection, we carry with us the names, the memories, and the strength of the women whose lives forever changed the country. Because remembering them, truly remembering them, is the greatest form of honor. As we step into the final chapter of this story, we look toward the future. A future shaped by the lessons, the losses, and the voices that rose from the shadows of a tragedy no one should ever forget. It's a future built on vigilance, on compassion, on reform, and on the collective promise that vulnerable women will never again be left unheard. Whether you live in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, or a small town miles away from any city center, this case leaves behind a question that resonates far beyond its geographic boundaries. What does it truly mean to protect each other? To answer that, we look at the systems that evolve because of this story. We look at the way missing person reports are now handled, urgently, thoroughly, respectfully. Today, when a person disappears, law enforcement activates a coordinated response, regardless of lifestyle or circumstance. Information flows between agencies faster. Alerts go out sooner. Officers check surveillance cameras, speak with community members, and comb through digital traces with a level of urgency that once didn't exist. We also look at the activism that grows stronger every year. Families, survivors, and community leaders push for deeper support, not just for those at risk, but for those impacted by trauma, systemic neglect, and inequality. The downtown East Side becomes a place not only of struggle, but of advocacy. Residents advocate for safer shelters, increased housing, better mental health services, and addiction support that meets people where they are rather than judging the paths that brought them there. These reforms aren't perfect. No system is. But the momentum they create saves lives. And that's the quiet victory that emerges from the grief. And with every passing year, the country continues to reckon with its past. National events highlight the ongoing issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Reports show how deeply colonialism, discrimination, and generational trauma contribute to vulnerability. And through these discussions, Canadians across the country learn that true justice isn't just about one court case. It's about truth-telling, listening, and long-term action. In local communities, new safety models are developed. Models that aim not only to respond to violence, but to prevent it. These initiatives focus on building trust, providing support before crises happen, and strengthening the networks that keep women safe. Outreach programs train volunteers to identify risk factors early. Neighborhood watch groups expand to include community support workers as well as residents. Social workers receive more training in trauma-informed care. And in these efforts lies a deeper truth. Protecting people requires connection. It requires seeing each other, really seeing each other, not as labels or assumptions but as human beings. Families of the missing say that if there's one thing they want the world to take away from their stories, it's empathy. Empathy for people whose lives are shaped by hardship. Empathy for those who fall through society's cracks. Empathy for the women who walk streets most people never step foot on. Empathy for the mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends who deserved safety, dignity, and care. And when you listen to these families speak, something becomes very clear. Their desire for justice isn't rooted in anger alone. It's rooted in love. A love that refuses to let the women they lost be forgotten. A love that shows up at every vigil, every march, every town hall, every interview, every memorial. A love that continues long after cameras fade and headlines shift. This love is visible in the way families support one another, even across provinces. Many of them become close friends, bonded by shared grief and shared purpose. They check in on each other during difficult anniversaries. They share photos and stories. They attend events together. Their unity becomes its own form of healing. In the downtown East Side, the women who were lost live on through murals, memorials, and the stories told by those who knew them. On walls painted in bright reds, blues, purples, and golds, their faces watch over the community, reminders of the past, symbols of resilience and anchors of memory. These murals become landmarks of love. At annual vigils, when candles flicker in the cold evening air, the community stands together shoulder to shoulder. People bow their heads. Elders speak. Drumming groups send vibrations into the night sky. Families step forward to share names one by one. And after each name, the crowd responds in unison, "We remember." Those two words carry weight. They echo through alleyways, across sidewalks, and into hearts. They mean we remember who they were. We remember their dreams. We remember their laughter. We remember their love. We remember their humanity. We remember their spirits. For many, healing also means breaking cycles. Breaking the cycle of silence. Breaking the cycle of systemic neglect. Breaking the cycle of stigma. Breaking the cycle of overlooking marginalized voices. And breaking the cycle of violence. Every time an advocacy group demands reform, every time a community holds a vigil, every time a family tells their story, every time a student studies this case, every time an officer rethinks their approach, another link in that cycle breaks. And while the pain will never fully disappear, the world becomes safer because people choose to act. New generations observing this case read it differently than those who lived through it. Young people look at the story not as a frightening tale from the past, but as a call to action. They understand that change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when everyday people care enough to make it happen. They understand that their voices matter, even if they're young, even if they're unsure, even if the problem feels too big. In universities, students studying criminology, sociology, psychology, and Indigenous studies continue researching the case with sensitivity and humility. They approach it not to sensationalize but to learn, to understand how systemic failures occur and how they can be prevented. They analyze witness testimony, inquiry findings, and research papers. They discuss ethics, responsibility, and equity. These students become future policymakers, investigators, counselors, and community leaders, informed by lessons that were paid for in grief. And beyond academics, the story becomes part of popular consciousness, referenced in documentaries, articles, books, podcasts, and films. But unlike many true crime stories, this one is not remembered for dramatic twist endings or sensational plotlines. It's remembered for its call to humanity, for its community awakening, for the reforms it demanded. In Port Coquitlam, where the farm once stood, the land remains empty, quiet, and unmarked. It doesn't need monuments or tourist signs. The people who know the story carry it in their hearts. The silence of that land becomes its own memorial, a testament to lives lost and a reminder of what vigilance can prevent. And if you visit Vancouver today, you'll see a community transformed. Not perfect, no community is, but aware. Aware of vulnerability. Aware of safety. Aware of history. Aware of the responsibility to protect. Police officers patrol with greater caution. Outreach workers operate with greater coordination. Citizens keep closer watch on their neighbors. People who once felt invisible now feel seen. And that visibility can save lives. Our documentary reaches this moment, this quiet, reflective point, where the past and future meet. The past reminds us of what was lost. The future reminds us of what must be protected. And somewhere in the middle of that reflection lies the promise of a better world. It's a world where vulnerable women are not dismissed, where missing person reports are not shelved, where advocates are not ignored, where systems are accountable, where communities look out for each other, where every person has dignity. It's a world shaped by tragedy, yes, but it's also shaped by resilience. The resilience of families, communities, investigators, advocates, and everyday people who refuse to let history repeat itself. And so, as we close this documentary, we honor the lives lost. We honor their memories. We honor the families who continue fighting. We honor the communities rebuilding from grief. And we honor the ongoing work toward justice. The story of the Pickton case is not one anyone wanted to exist. But because it does, we have a responsibility to learn from it, to grow from it, to change because of it. And if you take anything away from this documentary, let it be this. Everyone deserves safety. Everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone deserves to be protected. And no one, absolutely no one, deserves to be forgotten. Thank you for watching this documentary on Buried Secret Media. If you believe stories like this need to be told with honesty, compassion, and a commitment to justice, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing hidden stories to light and honoring the voices that need to be heard. Take care of yourself. Take care of your community. And never look away when someone needs help, because awareness, compassion, and action can save lives. This is Buried Secret Media, signing off.